The envelope contained enough money to feed Marcus Sullivan's family for 6 months, and all he had to do to earn it was look the other way when Vincent Cross's men collected debts from the struggling miners on the east side of Deadwood. Sheriff Sullivan stared at the thick stack of bills on his desk, knowing that his pregnant wife Sarah needed proper medical care, knowing that their 7-year-old son needed warm clothes for the coming winter, knowing that his sheriff's salary barely covered their rent in this corrupt South Dakota boomtown. But Marcus also knew that accepting Vincent Cross's money would make him just another bought lawman in a town where justice had been auctioned off to the highest bidder years ago. Standing in his office on that cold October morning in 1881, Marcus faced the choice that would either save his family or save his soul, because in Deadwood, South Dakota, no man could do both. To understand how Sheriff Marcus Sullivan became the last honest badge in a town where corruption ran deeper than the gold mines, you need to know about the promise he made to his dying father and the evil that Vincent Cross had brought to what was once a decent frontier community. It was January 15, 1881, when Marcus first pinned on the sheriff's badge in Deadwood, accepting the position from Mayor Edmund Fitzpatrick with high hopes and naive expectations. Marcus had served 4 years as a deputy sheriff in Kansas, where he had earned a reputation for fairness, courage, and absolute honesty. When the job in Deadwood opened up, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to provide a better life for his growing family. Deadwood in 1881 was a town transformed by gold, but not in the way the original prospectors had dreamed. The easy gold was gone, replaced by large-scale mining operations that required significant capital investment. Vincent Cross, a businessman from Chicago, had arrived 2 years earlier with enough money to buy up most of the played-out claims and consolidate them into a single profitable enterprise. Cross's mining operation employed nearly 300 men, making him by far the largest employer in the territory. But his influence extended far beyond his payroll. Within months of arriving in Deadwood, Cross had invested in the general store, the saloon, the hotel, and most importantly, the bank. By 1881, there was virtually no economic activity in Deadwood that didn't somehow involve Vincent Cross. Marcus's first hint that something was wrong came during his second week on the job, when Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison advised him to go easy on investigating a robbery at the home of Heinrich Weber, a German immigrant who ran a small independent mining claim. "Weber's just stirring up trouble," Morrison explained. "Claims someone stole his gold dust, but he probably just spent it on whiskey and forgot. Better to let sleeping dogs lie, if you know what I mean." But Marcus didn't know what Morrison meant, and when he interviewed Weber, the old miner's story was clear, consistent, and compelling. Someone had broken into his cabin, taken his gold dust, and left behind evidence pointing to members of Cross's mining crew. When Marcus tried to investigate further, he discovered that key witnesses had suddenly become unwilling to talk, and physical evidence had mysteriously disappeared. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Crimes against people who opposed Cross's interests were ignored or dismissed. Crimes that served Cross's purposes were investigated aggressively and prosecuted harshly. The law in Deadwood wasn't blind equitas purchased, and it served only those who could afford its protection. Marcus's awakening to the full scope of the corruption came when he witnessed the eviction of Margaret O'Brien, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident. Margaret had been unable to pay the inflated rent that Cross demanded for the small cabin where she lived with her 3 children. When she fell behind on payments, Cross's men arrived with an eviction notice signed by Judge Harrison Phillips. "This can't be legal," Marcus protested to Judge Phillips. "Mrs. O'Brien has rights. Her husband died working Cross's claim. She deserves compensation, not eviction." Judge Phillips looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Sheriff Sullivan, you're new here, so let me explain how things work. Vincent Cross owns most of this town, employs most of these people, and pays most of the taxes that fund your salary. Mrs. O'Brien is a widow with no income and no prospects. Who do you think serves the greater good of this community?" "The law serves justice," Marcus replied, "not the highest bidder." "That's a very noble sentiment," Judge Phillips said. "But justice is a luxury this town can't afford. We have order, we have prosperity, and we have peace. Vincent Cross provides all three. Your job is to maintain what he's built, not to tear it down with naive idealism. Marcus left that meeting understanding that he was surrounded by corruption, but he didn't yet understand how deep it ran or how dangerous it would be to oppose it. The full revelation came in late September, when Marcus discovered that his own deputy, Frank Morrison, had been systematically extorting money from the Chinese miners who worked the less profitable claims on the outskirts of town. Morrison was demanding weekly payments in exchange for protection from harassment, and when miners couldn't pay, they were arrested on fabricated charges. When Marcus confronted Morrison about the extortion, his deputy's response shocked him. "You think this is my idea?" Morrison laughed. "Sheriff, I'm just following orders. Vincent Cross wants those Chinese out of the territory, and Mayor Fitzpatrick agrees. We're supposed to make life so difficult for them that they pack up and leave. The money they pay is just compensation for our trouble." "Those men have legal claims," Marcus said. "They have rights under territorial law. They have whatever rights Vincent Cross says they have," Morrison replied. "And right now, that's not much. You can either play along and get your share of the profits, or you can cause trouble and find yourself looking for a new job. What's it going to be, Sheriff?" Marcus's answer was swift and decisive. He arrested Frank Morrison for extortion, filed charges with the Territorial Attorney General, and began collecting evidence to expose the entire network of corruption that controlled Deadwood. But Vincent Cross's response was equally swift and far more devastating. The counterattack began with Marcus's salary. Mayor Fitzpatrick informed him that due to budget constraints, the sheriff's department would be operating on reduced funding, effective immediately. Marcus's pay was cut in half, making it impossible for him to afford rent on the small house where his family lived. Next came the social isolation. Sarah Sullivan found herself excluded from church activities and community gatherings. Shopkeepers who had been friendly suddenly became cold and distant. Their son Tommy was excluded from neighborhood games and school activities. Then came the professional sabotage. Evidence that Marcus had collected mysteriously disappeared from the sheriff's office. Witnesses changed their stories or refused to testify. Judge Phillips dismissed charges against Cross's men on technicalities, while finding pretexts to issue warrants against anyone who supported Marcus's investigations. The pressure intensified when Marcus discovered that the Territorial Attorney General, who he had hoped would investigate the corruption in Deadwood, was also in Vincent Cross's pocket. The man who was supposed to prosecute corruption was instead helping to cover it up. By October, Marcus found himself completely isolated. Frank Morrison had been released on a technicality and reinstated as deputy sheriff. The other law enforcement officers in the territory had been warned that Marcus Sullivan was a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted. Even his own office had been turned against him. That's when Vincent Cross made his personal offer. The meeting took place in Cross's private office above the Silver Dollar Saloon, in a room decorated with expensive furniture shipped from Chicago and St. Louis. Cross was a man in his 50s, well-dressed and soft-spoken, who had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd business sense and absolute ruthlessness. "Sheriff Sullivan," Cross began, "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'm not your enemy. In fact, I'd like to be your friend." "Friends don't usually destroy each other's livelihoods," Marcus replied. "I haven't destroyed anything," Cross said calmly. "I've simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own poor judgment. You came to Deadwood expecting to find some idealized version of frontier justice, but that's not how the real world works." Cross walked to the window overlooking Main Street, where his mining crews were heading home after another profitable day. "Look at this town, Sheriff. When I arrived 2 years ago, Deadwood was dying. The easy gold was gone, the prospectors were leaving, businesses were failing. Now look at it. 300 steady jobs, profitable businesses, law and order. I built this prosperity, and I maintain it. Through corruption and intimidation," Marcus said. "Through practical leadership," Cross corrected. "I provide what this community needs: economic stability, social order and protection from the chaos that destroys frontier towns. Yes, I expect cooperation from local officials. Yes, I use my influence to shape policy. But the alternative isn't some pure idealistic form of justice. The alternative is economic collapse and social chaos. Cross returned to his desk and opened a drawer, removing the envelope that contained enough money to solve all of Marcus's immediate financial problems. "I'm offering you a partnership, Sheriff. Work with me instead of against me, and your family will be comfortable, your position will be secure, and this town will continue to prosper. Oppose me and you'll find that principle is a cold comfort when your pregnant wife can't afford a doctor and your son doesn't have warm clothes for winter." Marcus stared at the money, knowing that Cross was right about his family's needs. Sarah was 6 months pregnant and had been experiencing complications that required medical attention they couldn't afford. Tommy needed school clothes and books that were beyond their reduced budget. The small savings they had brought to Deadwood was almost gone. "What exactly would you expect from me?" Marcus asked. "Simple cooperation," Cross replied. "When my men need to collect debts or resolve disputes, you don't interfere. When I need certain people encouraged to leave town, you find legal reasons to make that happen. When problems arise that threaten business interests, you solve them quietly and efficiently. You want me to help you steal and intimidate. I want you to help me maintain order and prosperity. The methods are less important than the results." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing his family's immediate needs against his long-term principles. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with the weight of his decision. "Mr. Cross, I've listened to your offer, and I understand the benefits you're describing. But I can't accept money for betraying the oath I took to uphold the law fairly and honestly." Cross's expression didn't change, but his voice became colder. "That's a very noble decision, Sheriff. I hope your family appreciates your integrity when they're hungry and cold this winter. I hope they'll be proud that their father chose to do right even when it was difficult." Marcus replied. "Pride doesn't pay rent or buy medicine," Cross said. "But perhaps you'll reconsider when the consequences of your choice become more apparent." Marcus left that meeting knowing that he had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, and that the weapons in that war would be aimed not just at him, but at his family. The escalation was immediate and merciless. Within days, the landlord informed the Sullivans that their rent was being tripled, effective immediately. When Marcus protested that this was retaliatory and illegal, he was told that sheriffs' families weren't welcome in respectable housing. The doctor who had been treating Sarah's pregnancy complications suddenly announced that he was too busy to continue her care. When Marcus sought help from other medical practitioners in the territory, he discovered that word had spread about his troublemaking, and no one was willing to risk Vincent Cross's displeasure by treating the sheriff's family. Most devastating of all, Tommy Sullivan came home from school with a black eye and torn clothes, reporting that several older boys had attacked him while calling his father a troublemaker and his family unwanted. When Marcus tried to address the incident with the school, he was told that conflicts between children weren't the school's responsibility. The message was clear: as long as Marcus refused to cooperate with Vincent Cross, his family would be made to suffer for his principles. The breaking point came on November 3, 1881, when Sarah Sullivan collapsed at home and began bleeding heavily. Marcus rushed her to the doctor, only to be told that the medical emergency was beyond the capabilities of local practitioners, and that Sarah needed immediate transport to a hospital in Rapid City, 60 miles away. The trip would cost money Marcus didn't have, and the delay involved in arranging transportation could cost Sarah and their unborn child their lives. As Marcus sat in the doctor's office, holding his unconscious wife's hand and watching her grow pale from blood loss, Vincent Cross arrived with an offer. "Sheriff," Cross said quietly, "I can have a private carriage ready in 10 minutes, with my personal physician to accompany your wife to Rapid City. All medical expenses will be covered, and your family will receive the best care available in the territory. What do you want in return?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Your cooperation. Work with me instead of against me, and your family's problems disappear." Marcus looked at Sarah's pale face, thinking about the child she was carrying, thinking about Tommy waiting at home, terrified about his mother's condition. Every principle he had ever held about justice and integrity seemed abstract and meaningless compared to his wife's immediate need for medical care. "If I agree," Marcus said, "what happens to the people you're victimizing? The Chinese miners, the independent prospectors, the families who can't afford to pay your protection money. They learn to adapt to reality," Cross replied. "Just as you're learning to adapt, the world isn't fair, Sheriff. But it can be predictable and stable for those who understand how it works." Marcus was quiet for a moment, torn between his responsibility to his family and his responsibility to the community he had sworn to protect. When he finally spoke, his decision surprised even himself. "Mr. Cross, I need you to save my wife, but I can't promise to stop fighting corruption in return. If you're willing to help Sarah because it's the right thing to do, then I'll be grateful. If you're only willing to help her as payment for my cooperation, then I'll find another way." Cross studied Marcus's face, apparently trying to determine whether the sheriff was bluffing or genuinely willing to let his wife die rather than compromise his principles. "You would let your pregnant wife suffer to maintain your moral purity?" Cross asked. "I would let her know that her husband chose to do right even when it cost everything he cared about," Marcus replied. "And I would trust that she would make the same choice if our positions were reversed." What happened next surprised everyone, including Vincent Cross himself. After staring at Marcus for a long moment, Cross walked to the door and called for his carriage. "Get Mrs. Sullivan to Rapid City immediately," he ordered his driver. "Dr. Mitchell will accompany her. All expenses are to be charged to my personal account." "And in return?" Marcus asked. "Nothing," Cross said. "This one time, Sheriff, you win. Your wife gets the medical care she needs, and you get to keep your precious integrity. But don't mistake this for weakness or sentimentality. I'm doing this because I respect your courage, even though I think your principles are foolish and destructive." "Why?" Marcus asked. "If you think I'm wrong, why help me?" Cross was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because 30 years ago, I was a lot like you. I believed in fairness and justice, and doing the right thing regardless of the cost. Those beliefs cost me everything I cared about, and I learned that the world doesn't reward noble intentions. But I remember what it felt like to believe that individual integrity mattered more than practical results." "What changed your mind?" Marcus asked. "Reality," Cross replied. "The same reality that will eventually change yours. Your wife will recover, Sheriff, and your child will be born healthy. But this town will continue to need strong leadership, and strong leadership sometimes requires difficult choices. When you're ready to make those choices, my offer stands." Sarah Sullivan survived her medical crisis and gave birth to a healthy daughter in December 1881. The family's medical expenses were indeed covered by Vincent Cross, who never again mentioned the debt or asked for anything in return. But Cross's prediction about reality proved partially correct. Marcus Sullivan continued to serve as sheriff of Deadwood, but he learned to pick his battles more carefully. He couldn't stop the large-scale corruption that controlled the town's economic and political life, but he could protect individual victims when possible and document evidence of criminal activity for future prosecution. Over the following years, Marcus developed a reputation as the only honest lawman in a corrupt territory. His integrity made him enemies among local power brokers, but it also made him valuable to federal authorities who were investigating territorial corruption. The book's publication led to speaking engagements for Marcus Sullivan, who traveled throughout the West during the 1890s, sharing his experiences with law enforcement officers, civic leaders, and community organizations. His speeches emphasized that fighting corruption required not just individual courage, but systematic approaches that protected honest officials while they gathered evidence. Marcus's most famous speech, delivered at the 1893 Denver Law Enforcement Conference, articulated what became known as the Sullivan Doctrine, the principle that law enforcement officers have a moral obligation to document and report corruption, even when doing so puts their careers and families at risk. "The badge is not just a symbol of authority," Marcus told the audience. "It is a promise to the community that we will uphold justice regardless of personal cost. When we break that promise for money, comfort, or security, "We don't just betray our oath, we betray every citizen who depends on us to stand between them and those who would exploit their weakness." The speech was reprinted in newspapers across the country and helped establish Marcus Sullivan as a national symbol of law enforcement integrity. His reputation led to consulting work with major cities that were struggling with police corruption, including Chicago, San Francisco, and New York. In Chicago, Marcus worked with reformist Mayor George Swift to implement anti-corruption measures in the city's police department. The reforms, known as the Sullivan Standards, required all officers to submit confidential reports about suspected corruption, established independent oversight of police finances, and created protected channels for reporting unethical behavior. The Chicago reforms proved so successful that they were adopted by police departments in more than 50 cities between 1895 and 1905. The Sullivan Standards became the foundation for modern police internal affairs departments and established the principle that law enforcement agencies must actively monitor their own members for criminal behavior. Marcus's work in San Francisco focused on the complex relationship between police corruption and organized crime. Working with federal prosecutors, he helped develop strategies for breaking up the networks of mutual protection that allowed both corrupt officials and criminal organizations to operate with impunity. The San Francisco investigation, led by Marcus and U.S. Attorney Francis Henney, resulted in the prosecution of more than 30 police officers, judges, and city officials between 1896 and 1900. The success of the investigation established legal precedents for using federal law to prosecute local corruption and created models for cooperation between federal and local law enforcement agencies. But perhaps Marcus's most significant contribution to American law enforcement was his role in establishing the principle that police officers have a duty to protect citizens from other police officers. The Sullivan Duty, as it became known, held that law enforcement officers who witnessed misconduct by colleagues were legally and morally obligated to report that misconduct, regardless of personal relationships or professional consequences. The Sullivan Duty was incorporated into police training programs throughout the country and became the legal foundation for laws protecting whistleblower police officers. Modern police departments' requirements that officers report misconduct by colleagues can be traced directly to principles that Marcus Sullivan established during his fight against corruption in Deadwood. Marcus's influence extended beyond law enforcement to the broader question of how individuals should respond when they encounter systematic corruption in their professional lives. His example inspired teachers, doctors, lawyers, and business leaders who found themselves in situations where they had to choose between personal advancement and ethical principles. The Sullivan Foundation, established in 1900 with donations from citizens grateful for Marcus's service, provided financial support for public officials who suffered retaliation for reporting corruption. The Foundation's work helped establish the legal and financial protections that modern whistleblowers rely on when exposing wrongdoing in government and business. By 1905, when Marcus retired from federal law enforcement, he had become one of the most influential figures in American criminal justice. His methods were being taught in law schools, his principles were incorporated into police training programs, and his example was inspiring a new generation of public officials who understood that integrity was not optional. Marcus spent his retirement years writing about his experiences and mentoring young law enforcement officers who sought his advice about handling ethical challenges. His 1910 memoir, The Last Honest Badge, A Sheriff's Fight Against Corruption, became a bestseller and further cemented his reputation as a symbol of law enforcement integrity. In 1884, a federal investigation led by U.S. Marshal William Thompson used evidence that Marcus had secretly collected to prosecute Vincent Cross and several other territorial officials for mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Cross was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, and the network of corruption he had built began to collapse. The investigation also revealed that Cross had been systematically stealing from his own mining operation, skimming gold that should have been paid to investors and workers. When the thefts were exposed, Cross's business empire collapsed, and many of the officials he had corrupted found themselves facing criminal charges. Marcus Sullivan was appointed as the territorial marshal responsible for cleaning up the corruption in the Black Hills region. His reputation for integrity, combined with his detailed knowledge of local criminal networks, made him uniquely qualified for the position. But perhaps more importantly, Marcus's stand against corruption inspired other honest officials throughout the territory to begin documenting and reporting criminal activity. What had started as one sheriff's refusal to be bought became a regional movement that transformed law enforcement throughout the Dakota Territory. Vincent Cross served 7 years of his sentence before being released for good behavior. He left the Dakota Territory immediately upon his release and was never again involved in territorial politics or business. His former empire was divided among legitimate investors who operated mining businesses according to federal regulations and territorial law. Marcus Sullivan continued to serve as a territorial marshal until South Dakota achieved statehood in 1889, when he was appointed as the first federal marshal for the Western District of the new state. He served in that position until his retirement in 1905, having established a reputation as one of the most effective and honest law enforcement officers in the American West. The Sullivan family prospered in the years following Sarah's medical crisis. Their daughter Mary grew up to become a teacher and later served as the first female school superintendent in South Dakota. Tommy Sullivan became a lawyer and eventually served as a state legislator, where he authored several bills strengthening ethical standards for public officials. Sarah Sullivan lived to see her children's successes and to celebrate 50 years of marriage to the man who had chosen principle over profit during their darkest hour. When she died in 1925, her obituary noted that she had been married to the last honest badge in Deadwood, and that his integrity had ultimately saved not just their family but their entire community. Marcus Sullivan's badge, along with the documentation he had secretly maintained of corruption in territorial government, is now preserved in the South Dakota State Historical Society. His case files helped establish protocols for investigating official corruption that are still used by federal law enforcement agencies today. The story of the last honest badge serves as a reminder that individual integrity can triumph over systematic corruption, but only when someone is willing to pay the personal cost of standing up for what's right. Marcus Sullivan's refusal to be bought didn't just save his own soul, it began the process that eventually cleaned up one of the most corrupt territories in American history. In an era when cynicism about public officials seems justified by daily headlines about corruption and abuse of power, the example of Marcus Sullivan offers hope that there are still people willing to choose principle over profit, even when that choice requires enormous personal sacrifice. His story proves that the badge itself has no power. The power comes from the character of the person who wears it, and that character is tested not in moments of triumph, but in moments when doing right costs everything you care about most. The impact of Marcus Sullivan's stand against corruption extended far beyond Deadwood and the Dakota Territory, inspiring a new generation of law enforcement officers who understood that integrity was not just a personal virtue, but a professional necessity. His methods for documenting corruption while maintaining the appearance of cooperation became a model that was studied and implemented by federal investigators throughout the American West. In 1886, the Sullivan Protocol, as it came to be known, was formally adopted by the U.S. Marshal Service as the standard procedure for investigating official corruption in frontier territories. The protocol emphasized the importance of building airtight cases through patient evidence collection, rather than confronting corruption directly before having sufficient proof to ensure successful prosecution. The protocol's success led to the exposure and prosecution of corrupt networks in Arizona, New Mexico, Montana, and Wyoming territories. In each case, honest local officials used Marcus Sullivan's methods to gather evidence while appearing to cooperate with corrupt superiors, then turning that evidence over to federal investigators who could prosecute cases without being subject to local political pressure. Marcus's influence also extended to the training of new law enforcement officers. The Federal Law Enforcement Academy, established in 1890, included coursework on ethical decision-making that used Marcus Sullivan's experiences as case studies. Students learned not just the technical aspects of law enforcement, but the moral principles that should guide their decisions when faced with corruption and intimidation. The Academy's most popular course was the Sullivan Standard, which examined real-world scenarios where law enforcement officers had been forced to choose between personal benefit and professional integrity. The course used Marcus's correspondence with other honest officials, his documentation methods, and his strategies for protecting families while maintaining ethical standards. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who served as the Academy's first instructor in law enforcement ethics, wrote extensively about Marcus Sullivan's influence on modern police work. Her 1895 book, Integrity Under Fire. The Marcus Sullivan story became required reading for law enforcement officers throughout the American West and established the philosophical foundation for professional police ethics. Sheriff Sullivan proved that corruption thrives not because good people are absent, but because good people believe they are powerless, Dr. Morrison wrote. His example demonstrates that a single honest official, armed with patience, documentation, and unwavering principles can bring down even the most entrenched criminal networks. The memoir's most powerful chapter described the night when Vincent Cross offered to save Sarah Sullivan's life in exchange for Marcus's cooperation. Marcus wrote with characteristic honesty about the temptation he had felt to accept the offer and the agonizing process of choosing principle over immediate relief for his family's suffering. "I do not claim to be a hero," Marcus wrote. "I was a frightened man who made a desperate choice when all my options seemed impossible. But I learned that night that our greatest strength comes not from knowing what is right but from doing what is right even when we cannot see how it will work out." The memoir also revealed details about the evidence collection methods that Marcus had used to bring down Vincent Cross's criminal network. His techniques for maintaining detailed records while appearing to cooperate with corrupt superiors became standard practices for undercover investigators, and helped establish the systematic approaches that modern law enforcement agencies use to investigate organized crime and official corruption. Marcus Sullivan died in 1920 at the age of 78, having lived to see the principles he had fought for become fundamental aspects of American law enforcement. His funeral was attended by hundreds of police officers, federal marshals, and public officials from across the country, representing the communities that had been transformed by his example. The eulogy was delivered by President Woodrow Wilson, who praised Marcus Sullivan as a man who proved that individual integrity can triumph over institutional corruption, and that the courage of one honest official can inspire the transformation of an entire profession. President Wilson's presence at the funeral reflected the national significance that Marcus Sullivan's career had achieved. His example had influenced not just law enforcement but the broader American understanding of how individuals should respond when confronted with systematic wrongdoing in their professional and civic lives. Today, the Marcus Sullivan Institute for Law Enforcement Ethics, located in Deadwood, South Dakota, continues to train police officers in the principles that Marcus established during his fight against corruption. The Institute's motto, carved above its entrance, captures the essence of Marcus's legacy: "The badge serves justice, not convenience." The original sheriff's badge that Marcus wore during his confrontation with Vincent Cross is displayed in the Institute's museum, along with the documentation he secretly maintained of corruption in territorial government. Visitors to the museum can read Marcus's original reports, see the evidence he collected, and understand the painstaking process he used to build cases that could withstand legal challenges. The museum also houses correspondence between Marcus and other honest officials throughout the American West, revealing the network of integrity that developed among law enforcement officers who refused to be corrupted. These letters show how Marcus's example inspired others to resist corruption and provided practical advice for officials who found themselves in similar situations. Perhaps most importantly, the museum displays letters from citizens whose lives were saved by Marcus's refusal to be bought. Families who were protected from extortion, minors who received justice for crimes against them, and community leaders who were able to build honest local governments all wrote to thank Marcus for his courage and to describe how his integrity had made their own lives better. The story of the last honest badge continues to resonate in an era when public confidence in law enforcement and government institutions faces significant challenges. Marcus Sullivan's example offers hope that individual integrity can still triumph over systematic corruption, but only when people are willing to pay the personal cost of standing up for what is right. His legacy reminds us that the most important battles for justice are often fought not in dramatic confrontations but in quiet moments when ordinary people decide whether to do what is right or what is convenient. Marcus Sullivan chose to do what was right even when it cost him everything he cared about most, and in doing so he proved that individual courage can still change the world.